Ultimately, what we're seeing is that the capitalist world system has really broken in a historic way for the fourth time in 700 years. Capitalism always goes through fits and starts, so that part's not unusual. You're always going to find volatility, you're going to find breakdowns, etc. What we don't find, and is very rare, is when we get to a terminal crisis of an existing financial hegemon. And that has only happened 4 times in 700 years. That's what makes this unique. That's what makes this interesting. And that is what is at stake. Happy to connect with you all and have a chat in real time about what's underway in the world system. If any of you had read my 2017, 2016, both essays, The Great Divide, then The Great Release, a lot of this won't be terribly surprising. This was all relatively well mapped out in terms of what the overall systemic forces were and what's going to be underway during the Great Release. But of course, we don't know the exact form that some of this stuff takes. And so that's what we'll talk about today, now that we're seeing it shape up. Although, as I just posted on Twitter, like the requirements and the conditions that we put that I wrote about that we're going to mark the terminal crisis, like they're all there. Like all of these conditions are there because the deep structural contradictions were obvious at that time, and these are the very things that were going to have created the fracture as we find it today. So really what we're dealing with here, and I was thinking about how to best tell this story, and we'll do a bunch of questions and discussion and whatever you guys want. But ultimately what we're seeing is that the capitalist world system has really broken in a historic way for the 4th time in 700 years. And what I mean by this is, I mean, capitalism always goes through fits and starts. So that part's not unusual. You're always going to find volatility, you're going to find breakdowns, etc. What we don't find, and is very rare, is when we get to a terminal crisis of an existing financial hegemon. And that has only happened 4 times in 700 years. That's what makes this unique. That's what makes this interesting. And that is what is at stake. What does that mean? It means that a terminal crisis is the last gasp of a prevailing hegemon to try to maintain power over the current order in the face of a system that is demanding a reconfiguration. That is kind of what we're going through. Basically, the US is resisting the rise of Asia. I mean, if you want to put it in one term, the US is resisting the rise of China as the emerging contender to be the platform for financial hegemony in the 21st century. The US is the world's biggest consumer. China is the world's biggest producer. And so this is, and as I said on Twitter, they're both holding each other's leash. Like, American demand, consumer demand, is critical for Chinese growth, and Chinese production and Chinese capital and Asian capital in general, the capital of the export surplus economies, is critical to the financing of the US's debt, and the US's debt, particularly its social contracts. So the US has a bunch of very difficult social contracts in place with its baby boom generation, because of the entitlement programs, healthcare, retirement, etc., that it put in place after the war. Those things are costing a lot of money, and it has to borrow to do it. So these are some of the deep structural, constraints that are at play as these two elephants are trying to, jockey for renegotiating their position. one way to think about this, Michael Pettis is a great global economist who I follow pretty closely. He's got a great book out called Trade Wars Are Class Wars. And I think that says it really well, because really what this trade war is about is a class war. So what we find in the late cycles, these late cycles of financial hegemony, is and I'll go through this in more detail in a few minutes, but I'm trying to just give you kind of a tee up of what's at stake and what's happening. The elites of the world have kind of sold out the productive classes, is one way to say it. And so the reason he says that trade wars are class wars is that it is the way that the productive classes, the working classes, the middle classes try to pull back power from the upper classes. And the upper classes actually across countries have more in common than they do within their own country. And so Chinese elites have benefited greatly from this arrangement, just as American elites have. And the domestic classes in the United States have really, the domestic productive classes have really paid the price. What Trump is trying to do is submit China. I mean, fundamentally, that's what these tariffs are about. He spread it all over the world, but ultimately the target is China. He's trying to close off all of the ways that China might be able to, get its goods and services sort of shipped either to us via different routes or to basically ship their stuff and pick up demand elsewhere with other countries, thereby cutting us out of the global economic system to some degree and superseding us. So that's what's at stake. And the problem is, so that's why Trump did it in such a sort of a universal way. The problem is that he did it in a way where it becomes existential for China. I mean, really, the stakes are existential, and he's trying to submit them. I mean, ultimately, he's done something so onerous that he's trying to submit them. And he's also killed the U.S. soft power network in the process. So the U.S. soft power network has been one of the most extraordinary things, in the world for a century. It's had institutional leadership. It's had a sense of moral leadership. It's had a sense of it's kind of created and maintained the ideological container in which international liberalism and free markets have flourished, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying this is the first mark against it. Certainly it has. The Iraq War didn't help. Global financial crisis really began a lot of the problem. But like this puts the nail in the coffin. Like now it's very obvious it's very much common knowledge now amongst the international community that the U.S. days of being the sponsor of the protocol by which all international nations are going to trade and prosper under the fourth cycle of accumulation, that cycle that's been in place since 1945, that the U.S. is no longer going to play that role. And no one can rely on them to do it. That trust is gone. At this point, we are involved in a very anarchic space of a lot of countries that are going to like scramble for bilateral relations, and there's going to be this sort of anarchic search for what the new reorganized order can look like. So what happens then, because Trump did this in such a ham-handed way, because he did it in such a destructive way, is it opens up a massive opportunity for China to then make the next move. And because the stakes are so high for them, it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. But ultimately, the U.S. is attempting to kind of resist something that the seeds of this were planted decades ago. This has really been underway for 50 years, this gradual decline and this movement towards a terminal crisis. all of that by way of saying that's just kind of an introduction to what we're going to talk about. If you have questions or comments, just raise your hand or maybe throw them in the chat, and we can jump into them. Because there's a lot of moving pieces here and it can get kind of complex, I want to put it kind of at the right level and do justice to how everybody's tracking it. So please also provide like feedback on that. All right. Actually, let me stop there. Let me stop there after a little intro, see if there's any questions, comments, and then we can go on from there. Just raise your hand if you want to jump in. Okay. All right. Let me do this. Let me show you some slides which are going to show you what these cycles of accumulation look like. And when we talk about a cycle of accumulation, what we're talking about is the way that capital, which is mobile, globally mobile, and even globally mobile 600-700 years ago in ways that were just emerging back then, can seek out opportunities for its own proliferation, its own reproduction, right? So classic capitalist stuff. And because capital is mobile and seeking out its highest returns, it goes through cycles of accumulation. Like it'll rush into an area, the profitability will be extracted for a while. We're talking about decades. It'll decide, okay, profitability is starting to decline. Oh, there's another place that's going to allow for profit extraction. We'll move over here. And when you think about it this way, think about it in broad global terms. Like, okay, we're going to finance the empire of Spain to go to war over here. We're going to finance the expedition to the Americas. We're going to finance the setup of the trading network into the East Indies. We're going to set up the commercial networks from East Indies up into Amsterdam and the distribution throughout the world markets of Europe. Like these are big flows of capital taking place in 10 and 30 and 50 and 100-year segments, right? So these are big cycles of accumulation. And in each cycle of accumulation, there tends to be a financial network that more predominantly controls the flow and profit, the flow and the benefits of that capital than anyone else. And the first one that came along that did this was really in northern Italy in the Genoese Republic. And you're talking about the city-states of Venice, Milan, Genoa, and Florence. And this starts in the mid 14th century and it goes for really kind of gets organized by the mid 15th century. And then it lasts for almost a couple hundred years as it's financing the Habsburg Empire in Spain, the Iberian Empire, all the way through the 16th century. Spain has actually several bankruptcies. You'll see this all on a chart here. I'll show you in a minute, but I'm just giving you kind of a sense of the flow. And the whole time, what the capital is doing is it's financing what Fernand Braudel called state making and war making, right? So these big activities of capital finance. We make a state, you build out the infrastructure, you build out as we said, the expeditions, the commercial networks, all the stuff that the state needs, and you're making war because that's what they're doing. They're using it to build out armies and wage conquests, et cetera. So there's always this flow of capital into state making and war making. And from the capital point of view, they want to both kind of finance war, but they don't want to finance it too much because war actually gets kind of expensive at some points. That causes a lot of bankruptcies. It destroys a lot of capital. And also the capitalists themselves don't want to get involved in it because otherwise they get wiped out too. So there is kind of a tenuous relationship they have to this, but nevertheless, the interests of these large powers is always a process of state making and war making. For reasons that have to do with the way in which the capital finds its way into productive use, and then eventually kind of doesn't get as much profit out of that realm of things it's doing, which tend to be production and trade. So it tends to go in the first half of its hegemony into production and trade oriented activities. And then as that profitability declines, it then tends to move into finance, meaning how can it lend and do financialization that that allows for greater profitability to emerge in the second half of the hegemonic cycle. This has happened 4 different times. In the latest cycle, we see it in the US, for example, after 1970. So you're all probably familiar with the Nixon shock when Nixon took us completely off the gold standard in 1971. This is coming on the back of the declining profitability through the 60s after the US built out the industrial base after World War II, which was destroyed worldwide. So huge move into trade and productive build out. But by the late 60s, capital is in a little bit of a crisis. It then decides to move into a financialization mode. Okay, so the signal crisis, we'll show you in a second, the signal crisis of the US cycle occurs in 1971. Of course, we have a terrible decade in the 70s. Thatcher and Reagan both take us into neoliberalization that leads the world into a massive financialization cycle that we've been in really 4 decades since. So you can see this move from the first part of going from trade and production to then high finance. When you move into high finance, not surprisingly, if you are the empire, you are going to be extracting profits from the kind of imperial network, right? Because you're going to be making more money from the periphery. It's going to be coming into the country, but it's no longer staying with the productive classes because the productive classes the trade and production isn't really happening in the core country anymore because it's all been pushed to the periphery. And so that profit's now going up into your elite financialization class. And that's precisely what we've seen. Your 1% and your 10% are the big winners of this cycle of accumulation in the US. So when you see people say, yeah, we don't care about your stock prices, we don't care about your 401ks, we don't care if we have to wipe out the financial asset values in the United States, hopefully that gives more context to this idea that trade wars are class wars. Because there's an element of truth to that, right? That there's a way in which the financial interests, financial elites have extracted a lot of wealth from the globalization process over the last 50 years and brought it into the US, but then it's mostly just cycled to the top. And at least sort of putatively, if you squint hard enough, you could say maybe that's what Trump is trying to reverse. It's actually not totally clear what he's trying to do because he says a lot of different things. Like, I don't know, they want to stop fentanyl on one side with their tariffs, and then they don't like maple syrup. And then we want to bring down bond yields so that we can refinance. And we want to replenish our manufacturing sector, but no, we really just want a level playing field. And in fairness, maybe it's all of those. But there's not exactly a coherent sort of strategy or story that's coming out of this. And the way it's been handled is obviously a disaster because what it's done is killed confidence with the consumer. It's killed confidence amongst the capital markets. It's told everybody that this is a total clown car sort of regime and that you cannot rely on any sort of background stability. And so the effects it's going to have are going to propagate very badly from here. But again, we can sort of get into that in a minute. But that was a long-winded way of saying to just give you a sense of what you're about to see. Let's do this and this is a slideshow. All right. So the pattern in a cycle of accumulation is what you have over time. Oops, get to that in a minute. What you have over time uh, is surplus capital is growing. As your timeline goes, your surplus capital is growing. Each cycle comes off the back of a prior terminal crisis. Everybody see this okay? Hopefully. Um, it comes off the back of a prior terminal crisis, and then a newly reorganized world economy after the prior terminal crisis grows capital through expansion of trade. It's a period of relative cooperation as states evolve to follow the hegemon's reorganized development path. So this last terminal crisis was, call it 1931. That reorganization period started to occur, and the reorganized platform for capital's growth was in place by roughly 1947. By 1947, you've got the global agreement on trade and tariffs. You've got Bretton Woods, the financial arrangements. You've got United Nations. You've got all of these multilateral global institutions, which are now providing a new platform for the growth of capital at a higher level of sophistication, integration, complexity, scope, geography, people, and markets. So there's a big trade expansion, and then about 30 years later, 25 years later, it hits a signal crisis. As hegemon's relative advantage is equalized, surplus capital shifts from trade to high finance. We just talked about how that happened. And the financing of competition, interstate competition, creates wealth for the capitalist, but increases wealth disparity and social discord within the declining hegemon. So here, the interstate competition, you can think about it: South Korea, Singapore, Germany, Japan, at some point about 15 years after this, China, et cetera, right? And now continues a financial expansion, but all the contradictions are starting to show up. And this is the great release. So this right here is bright red, is a great release. It's where the system contradictions can no longer be overcome. And the hegemon, trapped by systemic inflexibility. Remember, it set up the system. So it's trapped by its own kind of system design in a lot of ways. So unless it's smart enough to redesign the system itself to actually anticipate and then reorganize the new system, the new cycle of accumulation or platform for capital growth, it runs into its own problem. And so that's why they always end up in a terminal crisis. And so you just get increasing disorder in the world economy, and what it does is it opens up an opportunity for a new hegemon to emerge and reorganize so capital continue growing. And that reorganization takes a while. I mean, in our case, we're sitting here in 2025. It wouldn't be surprising if it takes 15 years as we sit in this international economic anarchy, and it is a form of anarchy where it either stays, it sort of breaks into multipolar blocks on the one hand, or there becomes a new integrative synthesis that arises that allows for capital to continue to grow and expand. But then once that happens, you've got this reorganization and you've got a new platform, and the new hegemon reorganizes prevailing political and world economic capabilities at a higher level of complexity, capable of promoting, organizing, and regulating the world economy such that capital can grow again on a worldwide basis. This can get a little technical, like I get that, but I am trying to give you a sense of how this looks. So you can see if we look at, and obviously this is not to scale because this is not totally linear between these. The years here is not, the distances aren't right. I get that, but I did it in order to fit it all on a single thing. Is you can see how that cycle's kind of played out, and there's increasing complexity, differentiation, scope, and people as the global economy, and I put that global in quotes, right? Because global during the Genoese hegemony is smaller than what's global in the Dutch hegemony, is smaller than what was true for the British Empire, and then of course, in a true world market like the United States hegemony. And each one had this significant signal crisis and then terminal crisis. And then finally, just to say what I've already said, here is the US cycle itself. You get the end of World War II, all kinds of things were set up, massive trade expansion, start to move into a signal crisis by the end of the 60s and early 70s. Really, the neoliberalism and the ideological basis of the way in which the ideological seeds of neoliberalism, which had been planted decades before, really take hold and start to get listened to very carefully right around this time. This is when Hayek and Friedman and others become listened to quite carefully in order to restructure through the 70s. And the economy starts to become financialized, which it does then in the 80s. And that brings us up to today. So the terminal crisis, in my view, the terminal crisis, it was to me, it's very obvious that what Trump did signal, I shouldn't use that term because that confuses with signal crisis. It really marks that terminal crisis in a very obvious way. This is the US saying in like such an undeniable way, you either pay us to continue to be part of the US protocol and you solve for some of our internal contradictions that, by the way, we set up, or we're going to punish you really badly. So that is what's happening in the world today. That's like the fundamental that's the fundamental challenge that has been placed on the world stage economically and politically. And it becomes a problem, right? Because, excuse me, not only is the US cycle kind of has these innate contradictions which are inherent to the way it's designed the system, which we can get into in terms of the US dollar and the fact that we provide the world's both reserve currency and reserve asset in US treasuries. But we are basically telling them you can't trust our own protocol unless you pay for it. And so it really does open up then that space for a new hegemon to take its next steps if it wants to. And that's why I think the ball is really in China's court. Stefan, please. Let me.
Hey, Rob, very interesting stuff. I really haven't thought about it this way before. At the last, on the last slide that you shared, in the bottom right, there was a reference to, was it non-statal currencies or post-statal currencies?
Yeah.
What was that about? Or what is that about? I'm curious.
Yeah. So, let's see, I will, oops, no, I want to do this. There we go. All right. So let's see where to start this. Let me tell the story this way. This is really, it's a great question. Thank you. This is really important. This gets kind of the heart of the matter. One of the things that John Maynard Keynes told the US in 1947 at Bretton Woods is he said, look, if you set up the US dollar as the world reserve currency and you set up the US Treasury as the world reserve asset, then it is only a matter of time, based on the math, the actual mathematical requirement, it is only a matter of time before you basically run into Triffin's dilemma, which says that you're going to impoverish your middle classes. And the reason you're going to impoverish your middle classes is that you're going to have to supply capital to the world because you're going to be trading with the world, and you're going to have to provide them enough liquidity that as they save money, as those export surplus nations save money, they're going to be buying your financial assets. Your dollar is going to be overvalued, and it's going to create a wealth effect that ends up impoverishing your middle class. It's going to overvalue your own currency, which means it's going to harm your productive classes. It's going to harm your manufacturing sector. And by definition, you're going to end up in debt. Because by definition, if you are the reserve currency and the reserve asset, you have to end up in debt to do it. You're the bank for the world. He said this. This was not an unknown thing back then. Keynes was a genius. But anyway, he said it. And the U.S. response, this was in New Hampshire, the U.S. response said, fine, no problem, we'll take the hit points. And the reason they did, ultimately, is they wanted the power that came with it. Because you get immense power with it for a while. The immense power you get with it is you get to establish the platform. You establish the trading platform, the financial platform, and all the political power that comes with owning that political platform and that financial platform for the next 5 or 6 decades. So every transaction, or 70% of the transactions that occurred for the next 50 years, occurred in the US dollar. The banking system had to run through U.S. banks or the Eurodollar market, which is dollar transactions in foreign banks. The Federal Reserve of the U.S. becomes the most important financial institution on earth. Washington, D.C. becomes the most important financial center in the world other than New York. And of course, there becomes a political collaboration between New York and Washington, D.C. to do it. Now, this is it is basically a form of long-term suicide if a country doesn't recognize that that is a problem. Some people call it the exorbitant burden, because it's like an exorbitant privilege for the first 5 or 6 decades. Then it becomes an exorbitant burden for exactly the reasons we're seeing. It gives rise to populism. It creates massive wealth inequality inside the country. And ultimately, you're hanging yourself with a golden rope. So if we look at that contradiction and we say, okay, China's not going to be dumb enough to make that mistake, and they're not. They know that this is a problem. They've controlled their own capital account. They've been very careful about that, so they can control the value of their currency and keep it low in order to continue to basically be the producer to the entire world of all things, which is its own kind of problem, actually, politically for them. Then what? Let me go back to 1947. Keynes proposed a solution. He called it the Bancor. The Bancor was a neutral settlement reserve asset, which basically said, hey, it's going to be this, think about it almost like a proto-Bitcoin. It's like, we're going to do this thing where everybody can trade in and out of the Bancor, and then depending on your own trade volumes and the value of currency and a bunch of other stuff, like your own stuff can fluctuate, but the Bancor will be a neutral thing so that you don't impoverish your own country. It'll give you more freedom as a country. The trade-off is you won't get to control it quite as much. So now that we have digital currency, now that we have Bitcoin, and we have these other sort of trustless networks from a technological point of view, it is, I mean, to me, it's almost inconceivable that in 30 years, we are not on some form of a digital Bancor, basically a crypto Rails-based neutral settlement reserve asset that, yes, is sponsored by the next hegemon. If it's China, fine. It's kind of sanctified by them, but does not impoverish them over time, because it is not their reserve assets that have to come out of their country in order to finance it, or in order to provide liquidity to the whole world. The liquidity function can occur on this reserve, this independent neutral settlement reserve platform. Now, prior to 1931, what played that role was gold. Just to kind of set your understanding. Like what played that role was gold. And so currencies would fluctuate relative to the value of gold. The problem gold ran into, as Nixon discovered, is that the growth of gold the growth of the rate of growth of gold coming out of the ground did not keep up with the growth of the global economy. And so people were finding that their currencies were depreciating relative to gold because that's just forced by the math. And so by going to a free floating exchange rate, then it solved that problem. But it really didn't solve it solved the problem for others in certain ways, and it certainly didn't solve the problem for the US. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that I would expect a transnational, post-statal, so non-statal, digital, neutral settlement reserve asset of some form to arise. Some people from the West are going to say, oh, it's very clearly Bitcoin. And I'm going to say, not if China's the hegemon. My guess is that they probably wouldn't sponsor that as the protocol. My guess is that they would sponsor a new one that's not controlled by 400 Westerners, because the power law associated with Bitcoin's ownership has radically imbalanced that relative to its early start to a small group of whales. And so I would expect that if they sponsor a new protocol that's going to play this role and they're the hegemon, they're probably going to bring it out of the ground themselves as a greenfield effort. But it's all speculative. But that answers that question as best I can, Stefan. Yeah, Paul.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for this great analysis. And we spoke about it a couple of years ago when you helped me when I wrote my book, It's Not About You. It triggers to me a question from a bit of a European perspective. How could China become the next hegemon if it is so different from the four other hegemons that we've had in the past, where every new hegemon brought more human rights, more freedom, more democracy, all these kind of things that actually China does not bring about. And of course, speaking a bit from my own perspective here, but could Europe, if it would really come together and really develop something that is more transnational, be a contender to China and become the next hegemon?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this question. And we could really slowly, methodically spend 8 hours on just this question because it's really important. Because what China would represent if, in fact, hegemony was going to head that direction is the first non-Western platform for capital growth. And we'd really have to slow down and be careful in thinking about what does that entail in terms of what would be required for the force of the pressures to push the world into an integrative envelope that would be sponsored by China. What are the real political concerns that would prompt the non-Asian world to be in such pain or to have such contradictions with the current disintegrating anarchic landscape to say, actually, we're going to opt into the new protocol. And I think there's actually answers to that question. There's like rational ways to think about it. If China, and I suggested this in a tweet yesterday when I said that, if I were China, I would think hard about trying to win the 21st century right now. Europe, could they offer a guarantee, an offer to Europe of strategic stability of Russia so that Europe could de-escalate militarily and focus on prosperity? Could China open up markets to Europe that they're about to lose in the US in order to prompt Europe to form what is fundamentally a pan-European Asian bloc that, from Europe's point of view, would have been inconceivable 5 years ago in some ways, and all of a sudden may in fact be the prettier girl at the dance today, because they're looking across the pond thinking that the US is no longer an ideologically aligned partner in any way. And the US is doing nothing but, you know, I mean, values alignment would just be a fig leaf for getting robbed in the alley as far as what the US is attempting to do right now. Not to mention that they probably don't have a lot of faith that we would respond to our treaty commitments under NATO. So there's a lot of reasons why, when you think about it from the point of view of the existing geopolitical landscape, there could be a very interesting set of things that China could do that would be responses to the US that take advantage of the gaps and the problems the US has created almost unilaterally, right? That all of a sudden would have people thinking a different way about what's possible. Now, this would require a lot of true kind of integrative and enlightened and diplomatic thinking on China's part. But is it possible? Is that a moment where it could happen, or is it something that could happen over the next decade or more? Possible. Yeah, I think it is possible. Japan's another one that I mentioned. Japan's crown jewel of the Western Alliance, you know, post-war Western Alliance. Japan has a ton of capital, a ton of advanced manufacturing expertise. They have demographic problem. They could use markets for their stuff. You could imagine, and even though there's a tremendous amount of distrust and terrible history between Japan and China, you could imagine a situation where China doesn't, you know, as I said yesterday, like China doesn't make them a full partner or anything, but they just give them a way to have more strategic autonomy, and that it's more rational for Japan to start thinking about that. That's the kind of platform, when you think about creating a platform for other partners to participate in, that's the kind of platform that China could begin to do. Because remember, China's got, actually, I'll finish that sentence. So when I think about China, I think about just like the 10x rule. Anything you think you know about today, multiply it by 10 to understand what China's capacity is. You know, it's not quite 10 times the number of people, but it might as well be. Like, they have 10 times the PhDs every year, 10 times the STEM output, 10 times the R&D. Their largest tech campuses are literally 10 times the size of Google. Their two largest auto manufacturing plants are 10 times the largest auto manufacturing plants in the world, which are in Germany. Their markets may in fact end up being 50 years from now 10 times the size of you know, any other given market in the world in terms of their consumer market. So the amount of capacity they have, the amount of raw production and R&D and advanced manufacturing is now unprecedented. US is no longer anywhere close to the world's leading superpower in most of the ways that matter. Most of the ways that matter. And anyone that does matter, they've either just given it up, or they're about to, or it'll be superseded in the next several years. So in my mind, and I'm not saying this is, you know, totally a fait accompli. I think there are strategic accommodations that the U.S. might and could and may actually do over the next 20 years that could, you know, change things quite a bit, that allows for them to become the reorganized platform. But at this point, I wouldn't bet on it. So China could also go to the global south, you know, and as they have, right? They've obviously been heavy into Africa. The One Belt, One Road, all the way through Central Asia and South Asia and into the Middle East. They could continue to extend that network in a really powerful way. They could provide capital, technology, finance. They don't have to do it as heavy-handed as they have been doing it in their first iteration of One Belt, One Road, where they had this real kind of imperialistic bent, which caused a lot of mistrust. They could change the way they do that. They could learn from that. But you got to remember, demographically, every place in the existing cycles platform demographically is old and getting older. Japan, all of Europe, the US mostly is short of immigration. Yeah, I mean, there's no population growth. Where's the population growth? North of 3%. South Asia, Middle East, Africa. And if you want economic growth, that's what you want to bet on. So, yeah, so I mean, it's like there's just a lot of things that they could do depending on how they respond to this current provocation and this current basically act of war. I fundamentally see this as an act of economic war, and we'll see. I think the ball's in their court, but there's a lot they could do to begin to create a platform of really powerful incentives for the existing players who right now would say, oh, Western liberalism is it. It's all about our values. But I'll tell you what, that goes away pretty fast when you have Russia knocking on your door, or you've got your security umbrella has just disappeared. You've got demographic problems. You've got restive populations because your manufacturing sectors have been blown apart and you've got no consumer markets to sell to. The US has just slapped you with a bunch of tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of those things create the conditions by which a new platform can come into being that requires accommodations on both sides. It requires the existing clients on the platform updating what they think is possible and what they're willing to accept. And it require the new platform making the accommodations to allow for that reorganization of capital to occur that then solves for the contradictions of the prior one. And that's not a fake thing. Like China would genuinely have to create that integrative reorganization capability. If they don't, they could not pull off what I'm talking about. Like that's the thing. And that's why it takes, decades or more for this stuff to play out. But they couldn't fake it. But if they don't fake it and they were to take it seriously, they're absolutely a contender for doing so. Incidentally, this is one reason why at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, when I think about the meta crisis and our response to it, I'm of two minds, quite literally. I'm of a Western mind and I'm of an Eastern mind, and I think we need intelligent strategy and a stance for both. We need a way in which we could try to, if we're going to help try to bring an integrative worldview into being that had some form of eventual Western sponsorship, I think the same thing about the East. I think the same thing about how could you provide for the kind of intellectual steering resources that are going to be necessary in the meta crisis from the integrative worldview, but adapted to the Chinese view of the world or the Asian view of the world, that would help it to generate the platform for the emergent global economy. Not a small task, obviously, but we have to understand what's at stake first, and we have to be able to see that clearly before we would then take the next steps to do it. Yeah, Stefan.
Yeah. The question whether Europe and versus China has like a crucial role to play from here. It seems to me that China perceives itself to be in a position of strength, so they are less likely to make like fundamental changes to what they're doing. At least that seems to be the case right now. I'm not claiming that I'm a China expert or anything. Europe, on the other hand, is in a very similar situation to what the German states have been in the middle of the 19th century, surrounded by powerful enemies. Russia on the one hand, France on the other, Italy unifying, and a tremendously powerful England to the north. And under that pressure, you have big Bismarck coming in, unifying Germany, and it seems like Europe is facing a very similar situation right now. Very powerful, threatening Russia. How powerful Russia is, another question. Certainly has a lot of bombs. Then still very much powerful and increasingly erratic US superpower, and an emergent China, and internal political problems, demographic problems, etc., etc. So Europe seems to be like in a more of okay, we have to change now, otherwise our entire way of life is going to be changed for us. Whereas China seems to be in a position of, look, we have come this far. We are China, nationalism, key, president for life. Let's do this. And they're developmentally on I would say on an earlier stage from a large scale population perspective, still very much blue, right? Whereas Europe has this very potent mix of blue, orange, green going on, and very promising northern states and northern countries there. Sorry, I might be rambling here, Rob.
No, I mean, you bring up important points, which is, the difference between rich, developed countries and really, really big, well-resourced contenders that are emerging contestants to be the platforms for the next cycle. There's a reason why they are, in my view, better prepared for this than we are in terms of the contest. Number one, they have prepared for it. Number two, their political system allows for a focus of mind and pain in a way that ours doesn't. Number three, in some ways, when you're poor, you're closer to the ground. So the fall doesn't hurt as bad. We go down 10% in our stock prices, and all of a sudden every elite in the country is screaming like they got their arm cut off. So it's very hard for rich countries to wage any kind of long-term strategic battle and the pains that it brings, for a very good reason, because of the hierarchy of needs and the hierarchy of pain. Not to mention the fact at the end of the day, they've got 500 million people that will work for $4 an hour with a PhD. That's it. You lose. Sorry. You lose. It's as simple as that. It's like at some level, you just have to recognize that mass matters. The capacity for innovation matters. They have innovation in science we don't have. They're ahead of us. Probably not in every area, but in many areas. So, now they have problems. They have real problems. They're 13% of the world's consumption. 13%. The U.S. is 25%. Just to put it in perspective. So the U.S. is 25%. China is 13%. But China produces 33% of the world's stuff. So part of what this tariff battle is about is saying, look, you guys are overproducing relative to your population. And they just put $2 trillion into more investment into their factories in order to produce even more stuff. Now, why does that piss the world off? Well, because it's like, you guys want to produce everything, everywhere, for everyone, and leave no one else on the planet with anything to produce. And all you want to do is produce and not buy anything. That's actually the Trump administration's strongest counterargument to this whole thing, which will resonate with Germany. It'll resonate with Europe. It'll resonate with all the other Asian countries, Vietnam and what have you. They're also sort of competing with China for production. It's like, yeah, China scares everybody for a good reason, and China has really kind of not done a good job of hiding some of its wolf-like economics. And so that's their problem. They just overproduce. And so, without a social safety net, they have low retirement spending, no healthcare system. Like, there's a whole bunch of ways in which they're putting too much money on the investment side of their GDP, not enough in their consumption side, because they're not putting enough money back into their consumer class. They're not putting enough money back into their middle classes and their labor, right? If more of that money went into their domestic labor and population in the form of income or transfer payments or social security or healthcare or whatever, then what you'd see more demand for the world's goods flowing into China. Their trade deficit, or their trade surplus rather, would go down, and all of a sudden it wouldn't feel so unequally imbalanced towards them, right? So a lot of what's happening in terms of the U.S. is the trade deficit that's being sucked out of the U.S. Yes, it's happening because we're the reserve asset, but really it's happening because global trade has to balance. And so to the extent that China is really imbalancing their own economy to only focus on investment and only focus on exporting, but not really putting enough money back into supporting the growth of their people to be consumers, then what it means is that they want to run a trade deficit or trade surplus with everybody. And everybody feels like that's unfair. And of course, they keep their currency artificially undervalued to do it, to make their goods cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So they have their own problems here that everybody is going to be very leery about. And if the Trump administration's bet turns out to be even kind of right, it'll be on the back of people basically looking at that math. Okay, my 25% customer over here, or this competitor to me on the production side that I really scares the hell out of me. And that's China's problem to solve. They're going to have to figure that one out, because if they don't figure that one out, they are not going to be, they will ultimately, well, I shouldn't say ultimately, at least for a while, they will get countries that basically say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and partner with the US. I'm going to bring down my trade barriers. And then the US will ultimately be able to affect a bit of a cutout of China out of the world trade system to some degree. That's what's at stake here. That's why this is happening. I know it's a lot. Like, is this okay pace-wise? Are we doing good? Yeah. All right. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else. Please raise hands or pop in comments or questions into the chat, which I'll take a look at. Yeah, Mills. Let's see. We have to unmute you. I can't unmute you. Here, I just asked to unmute. Maybe that makes it easier.
It should work.
There we go.
Okay. I mean, I love reading these series of white papers and books and so on. This is the first session I've actually had a chance to sit in. What comes down, to me is that, the analysis, you're in the zone, you're bringing forth a lot of, well considered integrated thinking. As a integral life person, how do you see, what's the play got to be from the standpoint of, the integral community? Is that just too broad a question?
Yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine, because ultimately it's like, it's partly one of my jobs to think about stuff like that. And that is kind of why I said what I said about, first, I think we have to have a view of the world that has some big picture credibility, which I hope this one does. And if that's the case, then what we can do is we can look at what is underway as to the world system and its competing dynamics, forces, and sort of structural contradictions and drives in all four quadrants and many levels. And then we can say what is our best stance in terms of some possible transformative effects that we could have. And as I said, I think that if one of the lenses we're going to use for our own work is the idea that we're going to try to support a knowledge economy that brings into being an integrative worldview. Another one is that we're going to try to take the meta crisis seriously and make it object as something to talk about and to galvanize social action around as a second lens. And then the third lens is maybe a 20-year or more interregnum of competing geostrategic anarchy that is totally chaotic on the one hand, or anarchic, but on the one hand, but also provides interesting opportunities on the other, because it is a process of reorganization underway, and we need to be responsive to that. We need to understand that. Then we bring those things together and we start to organize social action to do it. So I've already been on the phone this last couple of months with colleagues in Asia about exactly these questions, and how to finding out what sort of problems they're encountering, what are they thinking about, and then how do we get integrative perspectives in front of them, because the stakes are huge, not just for us, but the stakes are huge for them too. There's a lot of money and a lot of power that is behind these kinds of issues. And so it only takes one well-crafted set of perspectives getting in front of the right people before they go, this is important. Let's metabolize this into our thinking or what have you, and then all of a sudden you can get some traction behind ideas. And if the Van Pellerin Institute could do it for neoliberalism 3 decades prior, there's no reason why we can't as well.
Exactly. No, but I think you're right on that.
Yeah, Mont Pelerin. Sorry, not Van Pellerin. Yeah,
no,
sorry.
I just said, I think you're right on that. You had talked there had been discussion in a previous one of these events, and the point of view was, expressed, how do we compete for attention? The topic is of such intrinsic critical need. You can definitely organize what the integral perspectives on the coming reorganization of our world. This is straight, everybody can be engaged in that, and then you've noted that it's got to be broad enough or diverse enough that it appeals to and is actionable from the perspective of different players. So these are all good things, and and it's a group. Ultimately it's a coalition building. It's a group. It's a group process that's going to have to find its legs, find its momentum. And but there's, as you pointed out, there's a lot of work to be done, and it ought to be fun too.
There are days it's fun. But yeah, look, if China is going to have to come up with an integrative pluralism, so are we, because you have to meet them where they are, and you have to meet all of these players where they are in terms of their own interests, and that's a big requirement. But yeah, thanks for the comments, Mills. Alan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I'm interested in how to support the movement of consciousness. Obviously, at Bretton Woods, we're eating the design that was put in back then, and a part of that was the lack of impulse control, right? So being able to grab hold of that power by the US rather than see a more collaborative way of going forward. As we move towards this, do you think the consciousness has moved, or how do we move that consciousness? Because that's just, very basic human appetite in there. So as
I'm
we're
sorry, Alan, I'm
moving
so
around,
busy screwing up with these videos. I'm trying to get the focus on you and Bill's. I don't know how to,
that's okay.
uh,
The content's the thing.
Yeah.
So as we're looking at that consciousness, where are the levers, where are the footholds do you see for the 30, 40 of us gathered here? You've got a lot of what has happened, and I really appreciate the interpretation of the underlying forces that are in our world. But where do we play? Where are the levers?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Because ultimately
Yeah.
what we want to find is we want to actually, ideally, if everybody in our network that was listening today, plus might listen to this, said, okay, I'm going to find one leader who might have integrative or proto-integrative consciousness to in any power center anywhere in the world, like all of a sudden that helps a lot because those are the people we need to start tapping into. Those are the people we need to start supporting to provide the institutional channels in for the kind of work that we're doing, right? Ultimately, it doesn't do anybody any good if it always stays outside the institutions. It ultimately has to get institutional uptake.
And there's a certain amount of self-preservation coming up, right? Where people are going to be more open to this information than before, because the world's being disrupted, and
Yeah.
a skinned knee is a good teacher.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, as I said before, Trump's a great catalyst for all of our efforts because of that. It's like it's new worldviews are a luxury good until they're not, and then all of a sudden they become a logical adaptive reply to real world conditions. And I think that's exactly where we're at today.
And so I think a toolkit in that territory where you can speak to anywhere from 3.5 to 4.5 about, how to interpret and hold those forces, so that for their survival good is not a bad structure, just to get a good foothold in moving up over that 15-year dip.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. You could do you could do it in a very interesting toolkit to support leaders to survive geopolitical transition via integrative big picture sort of praxis. So basically it's an ILP for leaders, but it's refracted entirely through the language of what allows you as a leader to navigate institutional breakdown on a global basis. That could be that could be a very good lever to put together.
But for me, it straddles, where the middle of the bell curve is for most of the population, and gives them a rung on the ladder up towards whatever might come next in their personal, organizational, political, etc. journey.
Yeah. Yeah, and you probably have a
Thanks.
willing and interested audience. Thanks, Alan. Meg.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Let's see.
Yes. Hi, I'm sorry to miss the first half hour of this, but delighted to see it occurring. I wanted to offer a couple of observations that build on the last comments. I'm speaking from Toronto, Canada, and I will say that some of the adaptive changes needed in this country are no longer a luxury good. They are widely seen as necessary today, and things we should have been doing for the last 20, 30, 40 years are now essential. Some of the risks we took with, a lot of trade with the US are now seen as a threat, and annexation threats are taken very seriously. So I have not seen the population change so quickly in my lifetime. So it's like these changes happen very, very quickly, and you don't go back from them. So that's just an observation that when something moves from being a nice to a have to, things happen very quickly. Either ratcheting up or ratcheting down. Could go either way. And it calls forth a level of consciousness that's needed, if you're lucky. The other thing, and this is just a personal observation, I've been working with a number of individuals teaching meditation techniques in China based on some of other teachers I've worked with, based on my own writings. I've been using that as a lever of consciousness on an individual basis. Bearing in mind the stage development, I've used that stage development model as the people who are in the room. Most of what I see is 3.0 and up. There is a cultural pull to 2.5 blue amber, but that's more my parents and grandparents' generation than who I'm talking with. And the level of flexibility and agility and uptake of contemporary Western ideas is phenomenal. But what's fascinating is to see ancient Chinese wisdom brought back in a new language, but tapping into ancient cultural roots. It's just beautiful to watch contemporary techniques, if you like, bring to life their own deep wisdom. So something about tapping into the archetypal best, if you like.
Yeah.
In each culture, I think is also an opportunity for all of us in whatever it is that we do, whether that's leadership work or estate training or survival kit development. And also wanting to point down that the China will very soon have already does a huge demographic challenge and a huge shift in roles. Only wasn't that long ago that women had their foot bound, and now they're taken over. The divorce rates in the interior provinces of China, I'm told, are 70%, 70. The women are not doing what their grandmothers did. End of story. So there's that sort of personal side of it as well that I think is also part of consciousness development that is an enactment of our economic systems. So just some observations. Thanks.
Yeah, I love that, Meg. Thank you. I mean, you're really, I love what you're bringing up there because it's super important to also have that in the room about what they're encountering as they come into modernity and eventually post-modernity in their own journey that's behind ours in the West to some large degree, but catching up, as you say, very quickly. And the contradictions that's going to put right in the center of the party, with the birth rates, with the role of women, with all the stuff that they're going to have to contend with. And yeah, they've really reanimated Confucianism as a form of kind of secular attempted state, like bring it back as a little bit of a national coherence in the post-Mao period in order to have something to reanimate a sense of populist nationalism. And yeah, so like all those dynamics are really important to notice and it could be that their contradictions kind of get the best of them too, and that they end up a lot more fragmented and a lot less capable of mounting a coherent, integrative platform for the world altogether. You know, another option is that it doesn't happen at all, like the cycle breaks, and that the future that we end up in 25 or 30 years from now, maybe because of technology and financial intermediation via blockchains, and I mean maybe a lot of reasons, right? AI and automation, all, you know, nuclear weapons completely changed the war-making calculus that had existed for 500 years before it. So you could make arguments that say, yeah, maybe the cycle of accumulation model breaks. Like maybe 50 years from now, we end up in a much more pluralistic kind of environment where there's not just one protocol, but there's a pluralism of protocols that are coexistent with, frankly, a lot of different kind of strengths and weaknesses and contradictions all kind of embedded in them. And that there is, maybe that's the integration in some way. So there's no way to know, but I'm really glad you brought this up, Meg. Thank you.
One of the things that plays out from that, to my mind, Rob and everybody else, is that, it's an impossible crapshoot to say what's an average level of consciousness globally, but if we're looking at something that has more reciprocality built into it, 4.0 from that development, you can enact those on specific projects rather than say that the underlying currency, the underlying fiscal structure. You can enact that on, well, let's tackle desertification. Let's tackle certain kinds of climate issues. Let's tackle certain kinds of medical issues. You can do these in sort of interest areas rather than nationalist based. We're already doing that with health. We're already doing that with other kinds of things. And then you build actual alliances and people who know other people. And you build those trust relationships on a global basis, but not based on the nation state. So, kind of crawling before you walk.
That network flattening. Yeah, exactly. And that network flattening is a really important component of the transformation age anyway. This idea that the nation state may or may not be as coherently powerful as it has been, and that there's clearly an attempt to re-verticalize. The MAGA movement is an attempt to re-verticalize in a network age. For example, at a deep structural level, that it's a blowback against the flattening of the network from green postmodern progressivism, and an attempt to re-verticalize the power structure to then rein in complexity, force simplicity through hard power, and force norms that are, to at least a large part of the population, regressive. So there is these attempts to re-verticalize against the overall flattening and network proliferation that's occurring everywhere. And how that plays out is, just one more thing to watch. So, okay, Taylor, hi. Thank you.
Yes. Wow. What an interesting group. What an interesting conversation. And thank you for your presentation, Rob. This is the first time I've heard about the possibility that China would be the seat for the next reorganization. As a kind of, my few remarks here are just kind of sparking off because it's so much that I'm processing with you guys. But one of the other smart people that I listen to on a daily basis is Peter Zeihan, the geopolitics strategist. And some of you may be following him. He's very down on China. He thinks China's going to be collapsing in the next 10 years, just under the sheer weight of the demographic crisis there. And of course, we're hearing a lot of counter things regarding the tremendous manufacturing and tech advances that they're doing, and you enumerated those nicely. But funnily, I've always been puzzled why he was so down on China. It was almost like he had an emotional thing, and I think maybe it's a shadow thing for him. That he's an American exceptionalist, still lives there, and everything else is more of a downhill from American exceptionalism. And China is a shadow thing for him, perhaps, if you're right. So thank you for that. And then I have a question. I think each of the the reorganization eras, the 4 that are in the chart, had their own major language that ran the show. Italian and Latin for the first one, and then the Romance languages, Spanish and then Dutch for those major kings, and then we had Bretton Woods and the global shift, and English became the new language, became the world language. and it's hard to think of it being unseated. But my question for you is, if China does end up being the seat for the next transformation, will Mandarin somehow become the new language? And is there a problem because English is one of the Hebraic languages, and neural studies have shown that the brains, the flexibility for things like the Renaissance and reasoning and stuff like that is partly a result of having a 26-character alphabet, and the way in which the brain handles the processing of all that stuff enables for much greater flexibility, much greater versatility, and even reasoning powers. It does the pictographic basis of the Chinese language model present a challenge there? And thank you.
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, I've thought about this. I don't think so. I think ultimately English is the lingua franca, and I suspect in any integration, it's probably going to continue as a strong platform. It may be academic because with AI, we now have the Babelfish, which is going to be able to do real-time translation. Now, I mean, the technology's got a little bit of ways to go, but not much. And so I think that from the point of view of the power structure language barriers, I think those are going to come down real fast, no matter what language ends up being the transactional language of the future. But I would suspect it's English, just because it's so entrenched now inside of, it's like transcend and include. I think that's one of the things that gets included, would be the guess. I'm aware of the cognitive science on the way in which different kinds of languages allow for differentiation of concepts. And sorry, I'll let you go just a sec. It is interesting the way that some of the Asian languages either close off some of that differentiable space. So I've talked to some of my Thai colleagues about that with Thailand, with the Thai language, but also the sort of some of the more organic holism that you get out of the Chinese language, that you could either say is either a disadvantage, or perhaps it's an advantage if you're looking for an integrative pluralism or something that can think more organically or think more in dialectical terms.
Right. So, and speaking of integrative pluralism, if you have a Chinese axis mundi in the next age, and English as the lingua franca, you've got both the Western and the Eastern Hemisphere in the sandbox, because by virtue of the language dominance, and that I just got goosebumps, because it feels like that's part of what's possible in a teal and turquoise transit stage of things, shall we say. And I'll stop.
And we can certainly say that we hope the teal future of our grandchildren is exactly that kind of integratively plural world. So let's see, other hands. Mills, I see your hand up again.
My take is that when it comes to languages, is that we're now in a different world of literacy. PowerPoint became the new diplomatic language. We now have right. When I went to school, you were taught the Palmer method to write, and if you printed, that was kind of frowned upon. But now we're at the point where if you can't make a video on TikTok or so on, I mean, there are different forms of formulating ideas and so on, which develop around communities, but also have international reach. When I would give presentations in Japan, for example, they would say, don't put a lot of text on the slides, give us the diagrams, give us the pictures. And and that overcame, anyway, it became a preferred, dialogue medium form. That's all.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. One other thing I want to mention too, because I've obviously spent a lot of time talking about Asia, but as I said, it is possible, and there are times where in the last decade I've said, look, I still would bet on the West. I still would bet on America to go through its release, to learn a whole bunch of hard lessons, to go through the social learning process that is going to be needed, and to have the enlightened leadership emerge out of that pain and out of that social learning process, such that the leadership is capable of then leading an integratively plural protocol on the back of a newly enlightened, I hate to use the word liberalism, but in a sense, still centered to some degree in Western values, but maybe an integratively Western values, like a broader sense of that. And there's some good reasons to think so. Like democracies are kind of dumb in moments like this, but they do learn, and they're capable of responding. They're capable of feeling the pain. They're capable of in a decentralized way going through the response process and the social learning processes necessary to get new leadership in place. It's going to be a long time yet, I think, but you never can guess how bad things get before an appetites in the populations change. And so, like I said, that is a possibility, and I wouldn't necessarily bet completely that that's out of the question. All right, we're at 12:28. I think we're almost at time. Any final comments or questions? Let me see. I keep saying I'm going to look at chat and I get distracted. Yeah, China's been a significant holder of debt. Yep. His name was Bancor. Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. France is looking pretty good. Yeah, well, everybody likes France. I love France. Yeah. Fourth turning. I've never been a huge fan of the fourth turning, just because I've never sort of bought into the generative mechanisms that are at work there. At least with a lot of these capital generative mechanisms, we can identify them and we can understand them, why they're happening the way they're happening. I certainly have no problem with the idea that generationally there's a differentiation integration process where generations, it's like 4 generations to create an artist, right? So like I buy that in some way, but whether you can expand that to these cycles of American history, I don't know. I'm much more in the camp of what Samuel Huntington showed when he showed that these creedal uprisings occur about every 70 years, which I've talked about. He wrote a great book on it that everybody should read called The Politics of Disharmony, where he basically, I think, nailed part of the story of what MAGA is what I've written about, with the rise of the financial elites basically taking advantage of the domestic classes as part of the late cycle of empire. And we've just spent 2 hours talking about that. But I think there's also something else to it, which has to do with the rise of postmodern progressivism and the overreach of liberalism to basically impose itself in people's lives, to fracture the public domain and the community spaces and all these other things. And what Huntington showed is that if that happens about every 60 or 70 years, it happens, you get a creedal uprising in America where people are pissed. And they will force the government to stop the overreach, and they will force it to pull in its overreach. And this is right on track. That it should have occurred right around 2020, and sure enough, it has. So if you guys haven't seen that book, I would highly recommend that as well. And yes, presentation will be available after the session. We'll publish it in the probably coming days. So with that, I'll bring it to a close. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Hopefully this is helpful. Welcome to the transformation age and the great release. You're living through it in real time. As I said, we weren't kidding. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.